You're watching a replay of Brain Drain with Rich Cabaceres. For more videos just like this, hit that red subscribe button.
Back here on the legendary 1480 WSAR, and for those of you watching on the Facebook live cam, hopefully you can hear me now. Somebody's making a little bit of a joke. I enjoy talking to myself, and I do that well. So you know what? Apparently you must live with me because I talk to myself a lot. That being said, thank you for everybody who was sending the comments talking about how there was no volume. Now you should be able to hear me loud and clear. Join the conversation below. We are talking about education. We're talking about how where this money should be invested. We're talking about why is it that we spend so much money on defense, but yet we don't make sure that our kids have access to an education, because 51% of our children in the United States are living in poverty right now, and we have no plan to fix any of that. And if anything, kids have less access to a high education than they did a decade ago. What are we doing in order to be able to fix this? You're live on the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning. Hello. You're live on the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
How you doing, Rich?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
We weathered a storm. We don't have money to pay for education anymore. High property tax. 65% of what we produce gross domestic product this country goes to pay off our national debt. We have to pay off $486 million a year just on our interest. We got trillions of dollars. We have trillions of dollars as far as trading balances with other countries just dumping the cheap stuff here. We don't have money every year to be paying for more education. We've been paying higher and higher taxes, more and more for education year after year. And what we have kids with no writing utensils. They have no paper. They have no books. Can't bring them home because they don't have no money. We're paying money for pensions, building, upkeep, all this other stuff. Where are we going to get the money?
No.
We got no money. Country's broke. I don't know what you're talking about. We're the richest nation. We're the most indebted nation in the world. Look it up, Rich.
Now the funny thing that about the whole argument is, what I'm saying is maybe we should look for funds in other portions of the budget. So one of the things that we can do is look at the defense budget, which is astronomical, and say, hey, maybe if we follow the Second Amendment and people have access to guns, we could decrease the defense budget, and all these private contractors who are making six figures a year per person, we could decrease those jobs, and we could put that money into education. And then when we do that, we can extend the learning day.
What about the trillions of dollars we gave to Iran?
All right.
What about giving money to Israel,
all right.
Mexico, all these other subsidies? Why are we giving money away?
We're speaking.
We can't even take care of our folks here.
But I think we're speaking the same language. If we cut some of these things that we don't necessarily need to spend money on, what would happen at that point in time? We could.
What about United Nations? Hundreds of millions of dollars.
All right. Let's stop.
What about Europeans? They need to stop paying.
Let's stop
the
what.
To be paying for the muckies there to live it up.
All right. Let's stop the what about argument, and let's talk about the actual issue at hand, which is education. And I hear you. There's a whole bunch of issues going on. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can point to that has been inappropriate spending. I agree with that. And that's the point that I'm talking about. When are we going to stop investing in things that make absolutely no sense and start investing in our children? Right now, 51% of our children in the United States are living in poverty. And
that number's getting higher and higher.
And it's getting higher.
There's a lack of jobs. I don't care about Donald Trump when he's talking about jobs. I want to see the jobs. I don't see no jobs around here.
And that's part of
the children are leaving here. I really don't. I'm real concerned about youngsters, because I'm going to tell you right now, they can get a piece of paper that there's just so many people out there looking for jobs. There's just not enough jobs to go around.
Right, and a college education isn't helping people get jobs. It used to at one point in time, and it used to get you a better paying job. Now, more and more people are graduating from college, and they're not able to get access to a good job. And the reason is too many people have college degrees because we're trying to keep people out of the workforce longer and longer. And this is also a derivative of poor education. Poor education in our system.
I got one more point for you. Like UMass Dartmouth, all the UMass campuses, right? You got six-figure professors, some of them part-time, making good money. Administrators, chancellors. Hey, let's get up the fat from the high administrative costs. That we need to do. We pay $27,000 a year, almost $30,000 for state calls. That's unheard of. Too many people are living high off the trough. A lot of those chancellors and deans, I say, cut the waste.
All right, thank you so much. Have a great day. And, I want to add this piece to it because, again, one of the reasons why we were able to succeed, especially in the early 1900s, was because of the fact that or the mid 1900s, is we were investing in education. We were investing in kids having access to a good education, and we made sure that everybody had equal education. That is going away. Unfortunately, what's happening is now more than ever, we are spending less money on education and more on defense. How does that make sense? We are already spending we are spending more money than our 10 closest spenders in defense combined. How does that make sense? Right now, if you are in a place that has underfunded schools because people can't afford to pay the taxes on it, you're better off going to another place and paying more taxes and going to another place and potentially live in poverty in a wealthier place to get your kids into a good school, because they're going to have more likelihood of being able to go and get a real job and a great education or start their own company. Unfortunately, in places that underfund schools, and it's a lot of times because of state funding, a lot of times because of municipal funding, because again, we're fighting this war on drugs that we're losing every single day, and the fight continues to happen. We continue to lock people up for marijuana. How does that make sense? We could spend those dollars right now on getting kids an education, not only teach them about how they shouldn't use drugs, but we can also teach them the things that they need to learn to succeed in life. We can extend the learning day if we're willing to spend the money. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is people aren't willing to spend that money because they're more worried about here and now with defense. You're live in the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. I had a quick question for you about the Durfee project. I guess as a voter, I'm sort of on the fence, and the reason is I think everybody agrees that Fall River definitely needs a new high school building. I agree with that, and my only concern is whether or not this project's going to have the correct oversight it needs, that they build a quality building that's going to last another 50 to 60 years, and not have issues like the current building where right as soon as they built it, they already have problems with it. And
I think you bring up some concerns that the average person. So if you're watching outside of Massachusetts, just for a quick explanation, my city, the city of Fall River, is going to be voting on a debt exclusion to get a new high school. And if you don't know what a debt exclusion is, basically that means that they're willing to spend above their taxes to get a new Durfee high school. Now the issue is the previous high school didn't have it didn't reach its useful life because of corruption and lack of oversight and all this other stuff. So here's the first part. The first part is the building was built poor, and I think that has been worked out. The second part is you need to rely on elected officials who aren't going to let these buildings just fall into decay. And I don't know that exists yet. So I think what you have to do, I think it's necessary to have a new Durfee High School, but a year from now, when you vote for new local elected officials, you make sure that you put people in there that are fiscally responsible as opposed to telling you what you want to do. I think that's the answer.
I want to say I read in the Herald News, or it might have been online, that the group, I think they just aired a commercial about, pro Durfee building a new building. I thought I read they raised like $60,000, and I hope I'm accurate in that information, because that makes me suspicious about how they could raise that much money so fast. And again, I agree that we need a new building, and my main concern is just making sure everything's done correctly and it's a quality building. Thanks for taking my call.
Have a great day. I think a lot of people share your concerns. The question is a building enough? I think that it's important that we have a new building, but I also think that it's important to I think it's also important to make sure that we follow through with it. We make sure that we invest the money in education so kids also have opportunity to extended learning days. Thank you so much for your call. We're going to go into a commercial break. On the other side of the break, we're going to continue talking about how your government spends money and whether that money should go towards education, aka investing in our future, or should it continue to go towards things about the here and now, making sure that politicians are living lavishly, making sure that they're living on six-figure incomes, all on your back. Never mind the fact that 51% of our children are living in poverty. And that's right. We're talking about the youth of our nation, and we are talking about why is it that we spend more money on defense, we spend more money on the war on drugs, we spend more money on everything else than education, than making sure that our kids have the equal access to have a great education? Because unfortunately, what happens is the people who really benefit are the wealthy. Meanwhile, if you live in a poor community, your child is more likely to get an education and end up in poverty again simply because of the fact that they live where they live, because they didn't have access to the education, because the state isn't willing to spend the money on the education. The local government is more so concerned about spending money on the war on drugs as opposed to education. And then you have the national government reducing the amount of money that they give in aid towards education. Instead, they're increasing the amount of money we spend on defense. You're live in a legendary 1480 WSAR. What say you?
I'm wondering, do you think that the government spent more in the 50s on defense or education?
I don't know.
I do, because the federal government didn't spend anything on education in the 50s.
Okay.
And guess where the United States ranked amongst educational attainment at that time?
Among the top.
We were number one.
Okay.
We were number one right up until about the mid-70s.
Okay.
And then the Department of Education was instituted. It actually took a cabinet position it became a full cabinet position
So are you
in
saying
1980 under Ronald Reagan.
So are you saying that the Department of Education has caused this problem?
It's allowed municipalities and states to kind of push it up the chain. You know what I mean? Instead of focusing on it themselves and taking care of it, because it was a priority, right? And it should always be a priority because, there's less time. Well, that and the degradation of family probably had a lot to do with it, too.
And it
Because,
also...
the people who were in charge were actually family members, right? They were family people. Women, men, they had kids, they had wives.
And
they made sure that their kids were educated.
And I can agree with that. The degradation of society has started to kind of breed into our schools. And there's teachers right now, if you ask them, they will talk about how they want to tell their parents about something that their kid did wrong. And unfortunately, the parent won't listen. So there's also a societal issue with this, and part of that is because we failed to invest in our children in the previous generation. So now we have this group of people who are having people, this group of adults who have children who care more about themselves than their children. So they're more concerned about their Facebook posts, or they're more concerned about their Instagram posts or how they look on social media than they are concerned about their kids having great grades in school. And really, the only purpose of their...
started with the Me generation, which is why they were called the Me generation.
It started before that. It started because of the and allowing people to think that they could be whatever they want to be. You know what? In the real world, you can't be whatever you want to be. That's
Well, you can sure as hell try and fail.
If you're 5'5", the odds of you being an NBA player is highly unlikely. If you weigh 100 pounds, the odds of you playing in the NFL is highly unlikely. If you have an IQ of 70, the odds of you getting a PhD is highly unlikely.
Right. No, and there are limitations, obviously, to attain it. But in general, like we say, in the average student in the United States in the mid-70s was ranked in the world. That was just an average student.
And,
you know what I mean?
But here's the other question. Were we counting some other groups in that? Were we counting people of color? Were we counting women? Because at that point in time, the statistics could have been skewed to represent just boys.
Who knows? I mean, really, you can only go by what they present. But another thing that irks me about this whole argument for the building of the school is the numbers and the way they're presented and the people who present them. Honestly, like our superintendent, who doesn't live in Fall River, makes about $200,000 a year, and then he says, that tax raise you're getting is just a pittance. Well, one, you can afford it, and two, you don't have to pay it. So, honestly, shut up.
No, it's funny because when people make an argument that people agree with, the where they come from argument doesn't apply. But when they disagree with it, they say, "Oh, well, they're not from here, so they don't get it." This is what I say to them.
He doesn't have to pay the tax, and he's making money off our community through our tax dollars, and it's just going to make him look better to have a building built. if he goes on to another job. So, yeah, sure, he's all for it.
I disagree.
That's fine. You know, he can be for it.
I disagree, and here's why. If the building gets built and Fall River starts dropping, or a community starts dropping because they have a poor educational standard, a poor oversight, they're going to look worse. So,
right, and the building ain't going to correct that.
And you never know, it could. And that's the thing.
I don't think so.
That's the thing.
I don't think much. A building only has a little bit to do with what goes on inside it.
All right, so here's a question. Here's a question to you. If you are in a place that you're working and it has mold, that things aren't necessarily safe, and your employer doesn't have the ability to see if you're doing your job or not, what is the likelihood that you're going to put out a good product?
You know what? I drive a truck. My employer doesn't really see what I do all day.
They have GPS on you.
I do good. I'm good customer service. I mean, me personally, you got to take pride in what you're doing.
Right.
Right. You got to put the effort in.
But you know,
and
people.
It doesn't really matter. I mean, yeah, it's a little discouraging if your employer's a schlub. You know,
right?
But I get that.
And right now, the city of Fall River.
That's not the problem that belongs to the kids. That's the problem that belongs to the teachers.
And right now, the city of Fall River.
To their parents.
And here's the issue: right now, the city of Fall River, the state of Massachusetts, and the United States are schlubs when it comes to their children. They're slubs. They're slubs when it comes.
Let me say another thing about the argument for the finances is they use these numbers like whatever it's 90 whatever million for the exclusion, and the total is 250 whatever it is. And they haven't even taken a bid yet. They don't know if that's going to be the number. You know, that's just what they're asking for. And really, if it comes in above that, what happens? Because once the bid is given, that's when it gets locked in, not before.
Thank you so much for your call. Have a great day.
Yep, you too.
And I think that there's a lot of points that the caller brought up. And I think ultimately when we look at it, people throughout the United States pay taxes, right? You have, and it's not necessarily just the city of Fall River, Massachusetts. You have cities like Flint, Michigan, which I'm watching a documentary on right now, and it's pretty cool, actually. Check it out. But you have cities like Flint, Michigan. You have cities like Trenton in New Jersey, who are dealing with the same exact issues, and people are being spread so thin, it's unreal. So really, when you look at it, everybody is paying federal income tax. And where does that money go? It's going more so towards $100,000 salaries for defense spending than it is in actual education. But if we want our future to succeed, if we want our future generations to be able to thrive, why are we spending more money than every other nation in the entire world than we are on actual education to make sure that we could potentially do away with some of this world crime? That's my question. And if we followed our Constitution, if everybody had access to a gun, truly had access to a gun and training with a gun, guess what would happen? We could reduce some of the funding that we give to defense. We could reduce some of the funding that we give towards the war on drugs, because now people are educated not only in not using drugs, but they're also educated in how to use a gun and protect themselves. Then we can invest way more money in education. Somebody on Facebook Live says, do you really think the politicians want smart people? How would they sell their lies? They also say, until the people making the rules have to live the ordinary family, how can they know the needs of the people? Great questions. You're live in a legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
I wish you'd knock off that gun baloney. What do you want to do, turn it into the Wild West?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
Come on.
So you have the right.
That's a harebrained scheme.
You have the right, and it's not a scheme. It's your right.
It's a scheme. You're promoting anarchism.
So,
come on, knock it off.
So here we go. If you want to have a conversation, then we'll have a conversation. So you made a statement. Allow me to respond, then I'll allow you to respond.
Well, it's not that important to me.
All right.
It's never going to happen.
All right. So how about this? How about the reason why I'm saying that we should do that is because it's already your right. So if everybody has access to a gun, we can protect ourselves. We don't have to spend money on big defense. We don't have to spend money on defense contractors making millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars. And instead, we could use those funds to pay for education. So what you would rather have is you would rather have us to continue to decrease our education spending so that way you can feel like you don't need to carry a gun. That's concerning to me. Really. that is concerning to me. And that's my opinion. Regardless of where you come from, I believe that you need to spend more money on education. The question is, where does it come from? So just me sitting here saying, hey, you need to spend more money on education, what is the answer there? Now you're going to have a bunch of politicians who aren't going to know what to do because they don't know how to come up with these answers on their own. It's up to you to say, hey, there's a problem with education. We need to spend more money on education. And how do we fix it? How about you propose some solutions as opposed to calling in and saying, hey, this harebrained baloney idea that people should have guns. You know what? They have the right to have guns. You have the right, who just called in, to have gun. I have the right to have a gun. And every single person who's in the United States of America has the right to have a gun until they lose that right. So why don't we utilize that to create some savings so we can invest more money in education? You're live on the legendary 1480 WSAR. What say you?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Very well. Unfortunately, if you look at the city of Fall River and you talk about poverty, well, how about all these wonderful big companies that are no longer here? Globe, Providence Pile, Pioneer, Duro. I can't think of any more. Even the small stores disappearing. So, even your local newspapers no longer printed here in Fall River.
Now, it's funny that you say that because this is something that's happening around the country. So what's happening is because companies are being priced out of their communities and they can't find good people to work if they are trying to stay in a community, they're starting to move more so to big city centers. So we saw in the 70s and the 60s, people start to move out to suburbs, and now the exact opposite is happening because of things like free trade. So, unfortunately, a lot of the things that you purchase, the things that you have on your back, the car that you're driving, is coming from another country, and they're getting deals to bring it in, which is losing jobs for us. On the flip side, we're not spending money on education, so people don't create new businesses. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is people are less likely to succeed because entrepreneurship isn't growing at the rate that it once did. And people don't have access to the job that would pay them accordingly based on their degree. So people are leaving some of the smaller cities and the suburbs by the thousands. That's called brain drain, and that's kind of what this show is based on.
Well, that brain drain you talk about was spoken about 4 years ago. I have several children. None of them work in Fall River. And yet there's jobs here that they do in Fall River, but they do not work here.
And here's the other issue. The other issue is once America got to be the top, once some of these cities became one of the best cities in the entire nation, those politicians then sit on their hands. They're like, oh, all right, we're number one, so what can we do from here? They don't try to stay number one. They're like, oh, we can relax now. And that's what happened in the 70s and 60s in the city that I'm from, Fall River, Massachusetts. You had a bunch of politicians who got elected to office who just got along to get along. They were more concerned about going to garage door openings than actually doing anything. And we've had to, in the past decade, at least in the city that I'm from, remind people of all the powers that the legislative body had. Because before that, people were just going along to get along with the executive body and the legislative body. It's scary when you really look at it. So really, when it comes down to it, there's multiple places. That happened at the federal government, that happened at the state government, that happened at the local government levels, where all these politicians just sat on their hands because they thought, oh, we're already at the top, we're just going to stay here. And they watched it ride down slowly, and now it's crashing.
Well, here's something that bugs me. Is when I went to school and I graduated from this place, 1958. So that shows how far back it goes. When you went in to learn something like Spanish or even Latin, it was a full year. Here in Fall River, they don't have a full year of a foreign language.
In Fall River and a lot of states, they don't have, or states and cities, they don't have ethics, they don't have philosophy, they don't have civics. They only focus on science, technology, engineering, and math. English and math. They only focus on STEM. And the reason is just to teach kids how to take a test. They're not teaching kids critical thinking skills. So again, why are we continuing to go down the same road when majority of the countries that are ahead of us in education and the education race, they have extended learning days? You know why we're not doing that in the United States? Because we don't want to spend the money. We're more concerned about spending money on defense, on 100,000, six-figure people, individual people, going and doing jobs that people in the military could do simply to make politicians' friends richer, instead of investing that money in education. So again, if we're so worried about defense, then let's use our Second Amendment right and funnel those dollars elsewhere. Let's stop the war on drugs. The war on drugs is not working. It hasn't worked since its inception. So why do we continue to spend money on stupid, foolish things like that instead of putting it and investing in our future, which is the 51% of kids who are living in poverty right now?
Another thing that is happening is the modern technology is wiping out jobs. People say it's correct, make more jobs. No, it does not. And also, the business I used to be in before I got ill, modern technology got there and wiped out whole departments. So,
thank you so much for your call.
Okay.
Have a great day. You're listening to Brain Drain on the legendary 1480 WSAR. We're talking about education today and how we can invest more so in our children and where we should take those funds from. And somebody on Facebook Live says, the bigger the government, the smaller the people. If God help us all. And, you know, it's funny because I disagree with that. I think it's the bigger the bureaucracy, the smaller the people. Because I think ultimately if we had more representation and people who actually represented you in government, then we could solve a lot of these issues. The unfortunate part is a lot of it is the same old people who are just saying whatever they have to get elected to office to make a six-figure salary. And really, it's the bureaucracies that are doing the disservices. It's the bureaucracies that are headed up by the same people who are actually creating the problem. So you have somebody in charge of the SEC who's part of the big banks. You have somebody in charge of FDA who was with a drug company previously. So how are they going to solve the issue? You're live in the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
All right. Three things.
Yep.
First of all, not the last call, that a guy before that. It's my buddy Jerry. He's an angry dude sometimes, but he's a great guy.
You got it.
Second thing, God bless the NRA. Third thing, I agree with you. The police arrive usually it's after the crime has been committed. The police arrive to take a report, get witnesses and try to figure out what happened. I think it is not only your right, but it's your responsibility to protect yourself.
And here's the interesting part about this. We spend so much money on the war on drugs that police are overtasked to do police work. Unfortunately...
Yeah, I felt differently before, but I agree with you. I think the war on drugs, I'm not going to say it's a joke, because I think you need to go after certain people for certain things, but some of it's just a waste of resources, to be honest with you.
I agree with you, and I'd love to have the conversation with you longer, but unfortunately we're getting at the end of our first hour, and I want to give everybody else an opportunity to speak before we go into the news break. But thank you so much for your call. I always enjoy having a conversation with you. Have a great day.
Have a good one. You too.
You got it. And the interesting part about this is we're spending more money on defense than any other country in the world. But are we getting the same kind of spending with education? We're reducing the amount of money that we spend on education comparatively over the past 20, 30 years. So how do we think that's going to impact our children? Right now, you have somebody who is the Secretary of Education who has never been an educator before. And what is she doing to be able to make a difference? I know when she first got into office, she was advocating for charter schools, which I guess you could call in and argue what you think about charter schools, but a lot of charter schools fail. And then unfortunately the children go back into schools and they're set behind. Depending on what state you're in, you've seen something like this before or you haven't seen it before. So the question becomes, what should we do to make sure that our kids have all the opportunity that baby boomers had? And unfortunately, they're not there. I just saw somebody tune in right now. College degree is having a tough time finding a job. And this is happening over and over and over and over again, even though they have a college degree from a pretty decent private college. So really, when you look at it, it's the type of thing where are we spending our money? Shouldn't we be spending money on our future? Shouldn't we be spending money on the future of not only creating jobs, but the future in creating a great workforce? And shouldn't our politicians be leading up that fight instead of just going along to getting along, doing the same old thing that they always do, just telling you what you want to hear as opposed to what you need to hear? Because we're talking about education today. You can also get us on the TuneIn Radio app, 1480 AM in South Coast, Massachusetts, all the way out to the Cape, into Rhode Island. So check us out, 9 to 11 a.m. every Monday through Thursday. And we're talking about education. Something else I want you to consider before we pick up the conversation again is what a community can do to make sure that their kids have access to a great education. And unfortunately, if you take measures away from helping the educational process, if you take education funding away, the likelihood of your community getting better is highly unlikely, because businesses don't want to invest in communities that don't have access to education. So what better way to make sure that these things are funded than your federal tax dollars, your state tax dollars going towards education, which can help every single community succeed? Unfortunately, that's something that isn't happening. And really, if you're in a place that's already poverty-stricken and you have to have the choice between investing in education and not, if you don't invest in education, the 51% of children who are living in poverty are better off going somewhere else, because they're more likely to get out of poverty where people are investing in education than not. You're live on the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
How you doing?
It's just a question here. When you're in the service, what branch was it, and what was your MOS?
I was 13S, and why is this relevant? Really?
Well, okay, if you don't want to, that's okay.
No, I was...
This is all part of a big picture.
Okay, so go for it.
You know of Jade Helm, right?
Okay.
Do you know of Jade Helm?
So what's your point?
Okay, I'm in trouble. You know the motto of it? It's mastering the human domain. Now look into that, and you'll find that.
All right, so rather than trying to call in and try to make me seem like I'm unintelligent prior to having the conversation, please.
I don't think that at all. I don't think that at all of you. If I thought that, I wouldn't listen to you, and I wouldn't call you.
All right, so please.
I respect you very much.
All right, thank you, sir.
And this is why I'm proposing it. I'm sorry I phrased it that way. I'll drop that issue, and I'll proceed, and we'll talk about education very soon. But you look at the picture, and people talk about connecting the dots. I have another way of looking at it. It's a big jigsaw puzzle that was prepared by a few people in authority, and we're putting the pieces back together. And the pieces include manufacturing, education, the economy, health, a variety of things.
All right.
And each individual piece is being put back into place. And it isn't for the sake of the United States. It is for globalism. It's mastering the human domain, not protecting the United States. And this has been proceeding in a big way. Well, one of the big jumps came when President Kennedy was assassinated, and we've been at war ever since.
Okay.
And that sort of thing. Now, and not getting sidetracked on economics and all that, although I could.
No, we can talk about economics. That's the thing. It's the type of thing where I want you to elaborate on your opinions. The issue is rather than calling in and saying, hey, do you know about this? Do you know about that? Just state your points, because I probably do. It may not be the name that you're giving it. It may be called something else in newer generations, you know?
My approach was wrong. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I apologize.
No. It's cool. Go for it.
Now we'll talk about education. The masters of this sort of thing go back into the 19th century, and the Rockefeller family had, like the Rockefeller brothers, they had a Rockefeller Foundation for Education, Rockefeller Foundation for Workers, and this all sounded great, noble, kind-hearted, but it was very Orwellian, pre-Orwell. And it involved education of the public in a way that it'll diminish their intellectualism and put them into great subjectivity, willing workers who will not complain.
So
this is where we are. And you're talking, money won't cure it. It's breaking this spell. It's paying the teachers like in a community.
So before you continue, when you say Orwellian, I want to elaborate on one of your points. When you say Orwellian, you're talking he controls the past, controls the future, he controls the future, present controls the past. So what you're saying is by having control of the education system, you can control what the future is and what the past is by simply owning the education system.
That's part of it.
Okay.
By Orwellian, I meant the phraseology. Education, like... it wasn't for education. It's for making people stupid.
Okay.
Foundation for workers. It isn't for workers. It's for the people who control the workers, and it's for workers in the sense that it would work against the workers.
So to move forward, how do we have better? How do we have a better education system then, in your opinion?
Well, it's understanding the full picture, the whole picture, and the powers behind it, and who's creating it, and that it doesn't work to the advantage of the average American or the average person. It works towards globalism. You have to see who finances it, the causes of the wars that we have, and it's for globalistic power. Like now, after the Boston bombing, they had the military come in and impose martial law on Watertown and like that, force people out of their homes at the point of a bayonet, in some bullet holes in people's houses.
Now, here's a question to you, sir.
All right. Go ahead.
What do you say to those who think that globalism is part of the way that we stop wars?
It won't eventually stop wars, but it will greatly reduce populations through wars, through diseases of various sorts, through their program for depopulation, and it will put people in a condition where they'll be enslaved or transhumanized, if you want to follow that.
Now,
program.
One of the things is people should have the ability to move around the world freely. And actually, it's a constitutional right that you have the ability to move freely. That being said, don't you think that one of the reasons why we are able to develop our culture, or do you not think this, that our culture has been developed and our knowledge base has been developed is because we've been able to reach outside of the U.S. borders and develop our knowledge based on the world as opposed to just kind of the four walls of the United States, which potentially there is going to be one wall at least, potentially.
Well, what you're saying about being free to move about, what they intend or what they really mean, the people in power, they're going to restrict that by freedom to move about will mean their freedom to take their money and build factories in China or here or there, or their freedom to bring people to this country and be employed at a minimum wage or sub-minimum wage, and the ability to bring our nation into tremendous debt to international bankers, $20 trillion national debt. When Reagan was elected, we had the greatest credit rating in the world. After he was through, we had the greatest debt rating. It's just being used, shipping stuff overseas, building up, as you say, unnecessarily in certain ways. And it's getting the whole picture. It involves all of these elements and others too. And so the desire to have people themselves to freely move about is going to be removed before too long if they have their way. Will be controlled, but the money and the power and the factories will be sent wherever they want.
Thank you so much for your call. Have a great day.
Yep, you too.
And, I really, really appreciate, and he and I have differing opinions. I understand the concept, or the people who believe that there is this ruling class that rules the world and they're controlling everything. I don't necessarily agree with that 100%, but I do believe that there are power players, and corporations have large amounts of control over the government, and you can see that in lobbying dollars. But we're talking about education, and saying that education is really just programming kids means the argument would be that we don't spend money on education and we just allow kids to learn however they learn, which would create a less intelligent society. How does that solve the problem? Maybe what we need to do is we need to figure out how to better get kids access to an education. I don't think that teachers, and if you're a teacher, call in 508-673-1480, let me know. You can comment on the J&J Jewelers Facebook Live cam, let me know. I'm pretty sure teachers aren't trying to indoctrinate kids to believe that they should believe in a new world order. I'm pretty sure they're educating children. And unfortunately, when people disagree with education, they tend to disagree and call it these liberal teachers or something along these lines, as opposed to talking about how every kid should have access to a great education in one of the greatest nations in the country, or the greatest nations in the world, I should say. What happens in a community that is already dealing with poverty if the education dollars aren't being spent? And I saw this actually in a community that I was born and raised in, Fall River, Massachusetts. What ended up happening is funding that should have went toward education ended up going towards public safety, ended up going towards infrastructure, ended up going towards the war on drugs, instead of actually going towards the future generations, because people in the United States and people where I'm from, Fall River, Massachusetts, got complacent. They elected people to office who told them what they wanted to hear as opposed to what they needed to hear. And what ended up happening is you created this generation of people who had a subpar education who weren't then able to turn around and reinvest into their communities. And it created a brain drain. It created a situation where anybody with an education left. So we've already experienced this where I'm from. And you know what? Wherever you are in the United States, you've probably experienced the same exact thing. Because jobs leave when you don't invest in education. So here's the thing. Right now, if you have the opportunity to invest in education, you better take it. Because what will happen is you will lose the opportunity to grow in the future. And you may not care about that. You may feel, you know what, I'm 70, I'm 80, I'm 90 years old, I'm 40 years old, I don't have any kids who go to the elementary school, to the high school, I pay for private school. You may not care about that. But the long-term economic impact of not investing in education is so negative, it's so bad, that it only warrants one thing. If education isn't being funded, you better leave, because it's not worth staying in that community. Because the odds of you maintaining a good job or keeping a job or that business not staying in that community and growing with that community is highly unlikely. I don't care who is in charge of the city. The odds of that happening are highly unlikely. You're live on the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Good morning.
How you doing?
Good. I had a couple of comments. First of all, I think the city does its best to fund education. I believe the number is about 66, 67 cents out of every dollar goes to education. Now, here's the kicker. How does that money get dispersed within the school department? Okay? This is what I want to get to. I know a couple of people personally that work in the school department, mentioning no names. It doesn't matter. I know they work there. And they will say there are, dozens and dozens of administrators. They don't even know what they do. And the first people that might get laid off are teachers' aides making $13 an hour. That's not right.
So here's my question to you.
You can't tell me that's right.
Here's my question to you. So you know that gravity exists. You may not know how it works, but you know gravity exists, right?
That's correct.
All right, so maybe it's the same thing with this. Those administrators are there for a reason, but maybe teachers don't necessarily understand why they're there, even though they're there for a purpose, a specific purpose that's very, 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 very necessary. So I understand where you're coming from, and I understand the argument that sometimes administrators and school administrations can be top-heavy, but that argument is something that it's a reason why you should start putting people in office who understand numbers, as opposed to putting people in office who look good or are telling you what you want to hear. Because ultimately what happens is we elect people to office who are like us and may not have a clue on how to oversee a budget, or may not have a clue how to oversee people. They may not have the experience necessary. And that's not necessarily just the city that I live in, Fall River, Massachusetts. That's every city. That's every town.
Okay, my next point on the new Durfee. I don't have any kids. I'm out of that whole thing. I was kind of against the new Durfee, and then I kind of educated myself to the situation, to the topic. And when people that are against the new school, when they start talking about repairing a building, have you ever repaired an older, dysfunctional building?
No.
Have you ever done that? I have. And when you say, oh, it should cost about $10,000 to fix this house, or whatever the number is, doesn't matter, and you start tearing things down and see what's behind this wall and see what's behind that curtain and see how this plumbing is or electrical is, and it's out of code and there's no rebar in this wall, those repair numbers could end up being what a new school would cost. So be very careful to start you're comparing apples to oranges. So if you can get a new school, and there could be cost overruns, I get that. But for people against that new school, it's going to cost you the same amount at the end.
Here's my opinion. Ultimately, I think regardless of where you live in this country, if you have the opportunity to invest in your children's future by investing in education, you better do it. Because ultimately what will happen is if you don't invest in that future, you're going to have this product that if they are intelligent, they're going to leave because they don't have faith in the people.
True.
And if they aren't intelligent, they're going to be forced to, or if they don't have access to the means to get a good job, they're going to be forced to stay. And it's going to drive down property values. It's going to drive down taxes. This sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's going to drive down property values. It's going to drive down your net worth. It's going to push away jobs. Sounds very familiar. That's because it's happened before.
Here's the problem when you have a city like Fall River, or let's say Taunton, similar mill-based, if you will, cities.
Okay.
We have a lot of takers in a city like this. There's always a handout, and they keep hitting the same people, the homeowner. They keep hitting that, and hey, that might be the only way to raise the money. You gotta hit that guy that worked 40 or 60 or 80 hours a week, 2 jobs to own a house. You keep hitting him. The other half of the city, it's always got their handout, the takers.
This is happening all over the country.
Hold on. One more point.
Hold on. Before you go to the next point, that's happening all over the country. What happens is the brain drain from small cities is happening, and they're going to larger municipalities so they have access to a job. And what's being replaced is people who are being pushed out of those cities because of gentrification without concern of where those people are going to end up. They're being pushed out of those cities, and they're going to some of the smaller cities and taking advantage of the system of those smaller cities, and all those cities are becoming depressed because of it. Now, unfortunately, what's happening is instead of investing money in education to try to get the city ahead, or towns ahead, or wherever you happen to be from, what ends up happening is they spend more money on the war on drugs, because a lot of times with low economic and low socioeconomic standing comes more crime. And they spend more money on things like that as opposed to the money that should be spent on education.
And the next thing, Fall River, every year I watch those budget hearings towards the end of the fiscal year every year, and it is a scramble to the 11th hour to fund police. We need more police. We need more fire. We need more teachers. We need more potholes filled. We need more lights. We need the water pipes replaced. It's the same thing every year. You know it. You were on the councils. You were on the committees. You know it. Every penny is precious in a city like this.
Well, part of it is because you have people who are in politics, especially in the lead positions like the mayor of Fall River, who are more concerned about his personal appearance as opposed to doing the job that he's actually supposed to do.
Well, that's whole. I'm not going to get into
Thank you so much
that.
for your call. Have a great day.
You're welcome.
And we're talking about education, how we can make sure that our children and our children's children have better access to the thing that they should deserve in the United States, which is education. Why is it that one of the greatest nations in the entire world has people who are in poverty getting an education that they don't deserve? Right now, 51% of our children are living in poverty. And when you live in a place that is poverty-stricken, the odds of you having a great education is highly unlikely. Somebody on Facebook Live, on the J&J Jewelers Facebook Live cam says, putting up a new building and fixing the education system are two completely different issues. One won't solve the other. Now, here's something that I want you to consider. If you work in a place that the roof is leaking, that there's mold, that there's lack of oversight, what are the odds that you are going to not only do your job, but do your job well? It's highly unlikely. Not only you, but everybody around you. You may be the example setter, but people around you, if they can get away with something, they may very well get away with it. Same thing happens at the school. So you have to look at it. If you were in those conditions, would you want to work in those conditions? And that goes around the entire country. Should we be investing more in education? This year we spent $15.4 billion in education, and we used to spend $21. Shouldn't we be investing more in that? Shouldn't we be saying, hey, instead of going down, we should be going up? I think we should double the amount. $30 billion on education. What impact would that have? Would people in poverty-stricken areas have access to books? Would they have access to technology? Because right now, in those poverty-stricken places, they don't have access to tablets. They don't have access to technology that could help them succeed in the workplace. Unfortunately, we squabble over these menial dollars when we could start attacking the defense budget, which is way overfunded. Because not a single person in the military would lose their job if we simply got rid of some of these defense contractors who were taking their jobs anyway. And we made sure that people used the rights that they had access to. You're live at the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Good morning, Rich. I've been listening and agreeing with a lot of what you're saying. There is some good news, however.
What's that?
But it's linked to education.
Sure.
The brain drain is reversed. The brain drain is reversing, and it's because costs are so high in places like Boston, New York, and San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
This weekend, my wife and I were looking at the real estate section. There's nothing in the Bay Area for under $1.5 to $2 million.
Can you imagine that?
And for the first time in forever, for the last 9 months, there's been a out-migration of middle-class families, not just poor people from the Bay Area, because they can't hack it anymore.
Now,
the places they're going to are less expensive places, but they're looking for places with good educational systems.
How about that? Because ultimately they're looking for places where their dollar is going to stretch further because the wage gap continues to grow. So they're looking for places that their dollar is going to stretch further because inflation is going to slowly squeeze them out. And right now they're probably going to the suburbs or the closest city that is near to them that has reduced rates compared to the major metropolis.
That's right. And my father-in-law just bought a house last week in New Bedford, and he paid $299,000 for it. In the Bay Area, that house would be $2 million, $1.5 million to $2 million.
And that's the interesting part, because unfortunately some of these businesses aren't following, so people are willing to take longer commutes, and this actually, so history tends to repeat itself, right? And we've seen this before. We've seen where people decided to move from city centers because of cars and because they wanted to live with a little bit more space or because they wanted to live at a lower cost. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is things are cyclical, and there's no greater example of that than the mall as we know it. The shopping mall as we know it. So people used to enjoy shopping at malls, and before that, they used to like shopping outside. So people used to go down these strips, they'd shop outside from store to store to store, and then they started complaining about being rained on. So then they created these massive malls where everybody could take refuge from the elements and still go and shop. And now they're going back to the model of going from store to store to store and getting rained on.
That's right. And the thing about California, I think it's happening in Boston, is the companies are following the families out of the cities. They can't afford to pay people enough money to live in the city.
That's
so
very
the
interesting.
Companies are leaving. Companies are leaving the Bay Area, and they're going inland in California to Stockton, Fresno, Modesto.
Really?
They're also in Boston and other places going to go to places like New Bedford and Fall River.
Well, we're
It's
seeing
the cost.
we're seeing Brockton actually starting to kind of grow in Massachusetts, and the reason is because they are it's where a lot of these folks who can't afford to live in Boston but work in Boston end up.
Yeah, no, and I think it's going to continue because the prices aren't going down here, and they're not going to go down for a long time.
And you know, one of the things that we could really do in order to make sure that we're taking advantage of that around the country is simply investing in education. Now, how do you feel about the concept that we should be using our federal dollars more wisely towards spending it on education to allow everybody in the United States to have access to a great education? Because the statistics are showing that if you live in a poverty-stricken place, the odds of you having a good education is highly unlikely.
My wife is working on pilot programs now around the country where they're going into the lowest income school districts and teaching kids coding from kindergarten through high school.
Isn't that awesome?
She's doing the videos to document it, and it shows, I mean, if you watch these videos, it's amazing how these kids learn. Kids that were at the back of the class in normal subjects rush to the front of the class when it comes to coding because they're good at it. And they get reinforcement that they can actually do something well, and it'll lead to a good paying middle-class job. So there are programs out there that could turn this around, but when the Congress keeps funding the Pentagon at higher budget levels than even the Pentagon asks for, they give them weapon systems they don't even want because they're being built in some senator's state. That's what it's about.
That's exactly what it's about.
You've hit it on the head. There is money there if we redirect it, and there'll be no diminution of our ability to defend this country if you cut a program that nobody in the military even wants.
Well, the issue is you have some politician who's getting elected on people keeping jobs of some obsolete product. And unfortunately, that's what continues to happen. And we elect people to office, again, who tell us what we want to hear as opposed to tell us what we need to hear. Now, imagine if every single person running for office had to tell the truth. Had to say, hey, you know what, this is not being built anymore, so either your company has to adapt or it's going to die. Imagine that.
Well, and I have a lot of hope in younger people, and not just people in high school and college, but people in their 20s and 30s, because what you have to do in politics is be willing to say, I'm going to vote what's best for my constituents. And if that means I don't get reelected, so be it. I'll do something else. And there are too many people in politics now who that's all they've done all their life.
And, it's funny because you're preaching something that I've said kind of for a long time. As you probably know, I was in politics for a little while. And that's exactly the way I felt. I'm going to tell the truth. And if people don't like to hear it and they don't vote me in because of that, then guess what? I'm going to go do something else. And that's what we should all be doing. But unfortunately, the people who vote are the people who have been told whatever they wanted to hear for the past 30, 40 years. And it's alienated this other generation who doesn't want to vote because they think everything that's being told to them is bull.
Well, but I think as some people from that generation decide to run for office, that may change. That's kind of what we're seeing around the country now on a number of issues where younger people are just saying, maybe we should run. My nephew, who's a sophomore at Suffolk University in Boston, is thinking about running for public office.
Good for him.
He graduate.
Yeah, and that's...
and I know a lot of younger people who are. And, I worked for a mayor. I was in politics for a little while, and I think everybody should go into politics for a little while to learn how it works, if nothing else, and to give your best.
Right.
Don't consider it a life career. I worked for a mayor who was
Yes.
a one-term mayor in San Francisco.
Yes.
And he did the right thing, got voted out, and people for decades have thanked him for the decisions he's made, and he feels great about it.
And I love that you said that. Don't think about making it a life career. It's too many times where people go to college, they get a law degree, and they plan on being a career politician. And unfortunately, that's not what it should be about. It should be about serving your community and actually giving back. And then going back to a job that you've created for yourself, a situation that you've created for yourself. It shouldn't be about going and having a career, because eventually what ends up happening is you lose the perspective of being a regular person.
There was a great TV series you may have seen called The Wire.
Yes, I love The Wire.
And I just watched All the King's Men for the first time with Broderick Crawford. And it's about these people who start off at being populists, wanting to do the right thing, and then they just make compromise after compromise after compromise to get reelected, and they turn into the very thing they didn't want to be.
And if you're a politician, if you're a politician and you're listening to this right now, look in the mirror, because you just hit the nail on the head. Look in the mirror and ask yourself, if you saw yourself when you first got into office, would you appreciate the way that you are now? And you're right. So many politicians go back on their morals, go back on their ethics just to get reelected to office because of the power.
And the thing you can remember is even if you don't get reelected, you're going to stay engaged and help people like you who will make the right decision get elected.
You know what?
So you can be part of a growing group of people who do the right thing. It doesn't have to be all on you. And then you can stand up to special interests and lobbyists and say, I disagree. I'm not going to vote with you. If you don't give me money, that's fine.
I couldn't have said it any better. I always appreciate your call. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
You too. You're live on legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Hey, man, last week there was a caller that called up about Children of God. So I don't have a computer, so I went to the library for a little while.
Yep.
Maybe there was a lack of communication between the both of you or something was messed up. There's a Children of God, and then I think the one he was referring to was childrenofgodforlife.org. Maybe you want to check that one out instead.
And, I went to that website as well to see what he was talking about. But again, anybody who uses the name Children of God, and I actually went and I looked at some of the references. There was a lack of reference material in it, and when I did look at references...
On which website?
The second one.
So you didn't mention that one in that other call.
But even then...
It was documented.
But even then, it was a lack...
to childrenofgod.com instead of stuff about pedophilia and
he said Children of God.
You never mentioned the Children of God for Life.org.
We're still...
I'm not 100% sure. I think that might be the one that he's talking about.
We're still on it, and it's crazy because ultimately what happened, and thank you so much for your call, ultimately what happens is when somebody uses a website, you should look at the reference material that they gain this information from, and even the website that you just referred to used poor references to come up with their opinions. So I appreciate your call. Have a great day, but I'd encourage you to use scholarly evidence, use research that comes from actual real people or people who have real degrees or real backgrounds in this information as opposed to this subjective search. You're live in the legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Good morning.
How you doing today?
Not bad. You?
I'm doing unbelievably well. What's up?
That challenge is still up, but that's not why I called. The United States membership into the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, in 1946, set in motion the destabilization of our society through the rejection of absolute morals and value, Christian tradition, and Roman law. Legislation authorizing the United States membership into UNESCO marked the end of the United States in a very crucial area, that of education. From this time on, UNESCO would dictate education policy to our government and others.
The idea, hold on a second.
This legislation was accompanied by President Harry Truman.
So again, you talking about the reason why education is failing is because of the lack of religion in education is absurd. And the reason
No.
And the reason is...
It's because we no longer have control of it. UNESCO dictates education policy to our government and others.
And even then, if you were talking about who comes up, it's ultimately the education department. So at any point in time...
It comes from the United Nations. Did you hear what I said? From this time on, UNESCO would dictate education policy to our government and others.
So
this was established in 1946. It's legislation.
Dictating policy and actually following through with policy that's dictated by a foreign entity is two different things. So let's be clear about that. So United Nations goes to a lot of countries to do peacekeeping missions. And you know what? A lot of people don't follow what United Nations actually says for them to do. So really, when you talk about United Nations and their stranglehold, is what a lot of people will call over the United States, it doesn't exist. United Nations...
Oh, wait a minute. So you're saying that the legislation never happened? Harry Truman never signed this legislation? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Harry Truman could have signed it all day long. Is it actually being followed? No.
Of course it is. Go read this is in Charlotte Thomas Isabee's book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, chapter 4.
You continue to reference
hundreds of other examples.
You continue to reference one book. Find other information to support that. I'm sorry, but you continue to reference this one book. You know what? That's a good idea. Maybe I should interview her to have a conversation about how she feels that people are being dumbed down. But the unfortunate part is, as opposed to finding information that disagrees with your opinion, you believe something the second that you read it if it agrees with you.
This is all written down legislation. It references government documents.
And I can point to 10 different pieces of legislation that disagree with exactly what you're talking about, because legislation changes over time and policy changes over time too. And here's the big issue. A lot of times legislation is not enforced. There's tons of legislation on the books right now that is not being enforced because people take their own policies and they implement their own ideas.
Have you read The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America?
I've started reading it based on you calling in every single time and saying The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. So yes, I'm actually reading it right now. And you know what I find it to be? Crockery. She makes some very good points, but a lot of them seem to be far-fetched. Thank you so much for your call. Have a great day. You're live in legendary 1480 WSAR. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Rich. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Good. The dumbing down of America, it's like they want to keep us docile through chemtrails and other kinds of stuff. And what's going on is a sleeping society is a slave society. And on that note, one of the gentlemen that called about the housing crunch that's going on in San Francisco out west and how people are moving out here, research. Now, Fall River is called an entrance city. Now,
it's a gateway
San Francisco,
city.
California is an exit city. So they're exiting out of the high-end area, and they're entering places like you were saying, Brockton, Fall River, New Bedford, because why pay $2 million, $2.5 million out in a house in California, come here, and you could spend a quarter of that, not even a portion of that.
But they're not coming to Fall River.
Rich, another thing. Why is storage so in demand?
So actually,
storage units are booming. Booming.
You gotta rather than kind of stating all your points, let's go over the first one, which you talked about. People are going to places like Fall River, New Bedford, and Brockton. Actually, they're not going to places that don't invest in education, and that was stated by the caller who's seeing exactly that in the Bay Area in California. They're going to places that seem like they're investing more so in education, so their kids have access to a great education. And if you're not investing in education, you're going to miss the boat, because usually, if you're investing in education, then businesses will come because their employees will want to live there, because their employees, and we're getting at the end of our show, so thank you so much for your call. Their employees will want to live there because their employees can have access to a great education for their children. So it's been great. I've enjoyed the show. Here's a novel idea. If we spent money on a valid education and a great education at the elementary level, kids may be able to get a job after high school as opposed to continuing on to college.